As you're reading through the address, a few things to keep your eyes open for. Emerson seems to be very fond of providing opposites. He really loves dichotomies. He loves seeing the world in sort of a dualistic manner. So he loves putting things up against each other. And one of the first things that he does is to sort of contrast natural law with man's law. Natural law being the laws that sort of govern not only the physical universe but the spiritual universe as well, and contrasting this with what we do on a day-to-day basis, how we construct, say, societies, institutions, and how out of sync our laws usually are to natural law, how inadequate they frequently are. You know, nature says do it this way, but we're intent on doing it some other way. So to Emerson, to a large extent, social and political reform are about changing man's law to better reflect what natural law is trying to get us to do anyway. Again, we see the difference between reason and understanding. Emerson is telling us in Nature, of course, the section on discipline, that it is reason that we're not really grasping. We have understanding. We understand how water flows downhill. We understand how scientific principles work. We understand mathematics. We understand a lot of things. What we don't have is that higher faculty. We're not nurturing that higher faculty of reason, the big picture, the deeper point about existence, nature, our role in this life. We're not getting that big picture thing. So he's trying to contrast those like he did in Nature, only trying to do it in context with a specific discussion about education. And naturally, being a romantic, he's going to privilege Kant over Locke. He's going to contrast what Locke has to offer, which is not inconsequential. I mean, Transcendentalists didn't dismiss Locke. What they said was that Locke's approach to understanding reality was more limited, and what Kant had to offer was something new and something interesting and a different way of approaching how to acquire knowledge and our relationship to the universe. A second thing that you should look for in terms of his strategies, when someone was asked to speak at the Divinity School address each year, frequently it was a sermon. This is obviously not a sermon. It's more of a secular kind of sermon, which was very different. Marx said as being quite different from its predecessors. But a lot of sermons, in case you don't know this, a lot of sermons, particularly Protestant ministers, but also Catholic and Orthodox Christian ministers or priests, would begin with a scripture. They would quote scripture, and then they would build an entire sermon around that one passage, that one verse of scripture. They might dissect it. They might sort of explicate it. It might not be a particular passage, or it might be sort of a biblical parable or something like this. But that's called the proof text, the thing that's offered right up at the top, and then you build the sermon around it. Notice that this particular address, not really a religious sermon, takes nature as its proof text, not some scripture at the beginning. It's very interesting when you contrast it to previous Divinity School addresses given by other figures where they begin more like a sermon with a scriptural quote. Emerson begins with nature. And it shouldn't surprise you, there's a lot of natural imagery throughout the piece. A couple of other peculiarities about it. One, there just are a lot of con words, and the prefix con used to mean with, not opposed to. He also has, I didn't put this in the slide, but he also puts a lot of emphasis on shrinking this and shrinking that. He seems to have been sort of on a hobby horse with some of these things as he's writing it. Well, some of the themes. Theme number one, institutionalized religion robs reason over and overemphasizes understanding. They really just want to focus on the minutia of dogma and doctrine and theological points and arguments. All of this, Emerson says, is missing the big picture that religion ought to be focusing on. It doesn't focus on the big questions. It focuses on the minutia of theology and these kinds of things. Most controversial to non-Christians would be Emerson's basic statement in here, implicit certainly, and explicit at times, it would be the worship of Jesus is symptomatic of this. Emerson is not, and I mean not, a Christian in the sense that he believes that Jesus is the one and only Son of God in the Orthodox sense of both Protestants and Catholics and Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox traditions. Not a believer in that at all. He actually believes that Jesus is just a very, very bright, very moral, very deep thinking person, very reflective person, and a person who we would do worse than model much of our behavior on. But he thinks that the worshiping of Jesus was a huge mistake, believing that Jesus was part of the Godhead, big mistake on his part. And he believes that institutionalized religion is what brought this about. Understand also, though, that this is in the early 19th century, and there really isn't an awful lot while these Unitarians are exploring, these sorts of questions about biblical accuracy. This is in the nascent period of apologetics when it comes to biblical texts and the transmission of texts. You didn't have an F.F. Bruce. You didn't have all these guys who came along later and looked at transmissions of texts and reliability of Scripture and these kinds of things. So these guys are kind of largely flying blind on that. This is the early years of that. So, apologetics were really something that was left over from the medieval period. There wasn't a modern apologetics movement. So it's really in the mid to later 19th century that the apologetics movement starts getting going. So Emerson and others, especially Unitarians, were saying, well, there's no reason to believe that Scripture has any sort of textual authority other than just somebody maybe just made this up. It's only a few decades later that people come back and really look at the transmission of texts and see, comparing things like, substantive and accidental variables and things like this, and say, wow, there really is a high degree of accuracy with respect to textual transmission, one version of the Gospels to the next. Anyway, that's more of a sidebar there. The second theme that he comes up with, though, is the notion that virtue is the essence of all religion, all religions, period, and that's really what we need to be seeking. It's kind of Franklin-esque in a way, this concept of virtue being the most important thing that we get from religion. The third theme is that the source of virtue is, of course, internal, that godness within you via reason, intuitive notion, which is best exemplified by nature. So there's our process there. We turn internally to find out truth. We utilize the faculty of reason, which is our intuitive knowledge, and we can cultivate that through observing nature for the spiritual truths that nature can provide for us. The fourth theme is perpetual revelation, and we'll touch on that here in just a moment because it's an important concept for Emerson. As you're